Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Liz Watts-Maluhos. I'm a research archaeologist and the collaborative research liaison at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. I will be the moderator for today's lecture. On behalf of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and my co-organizer, Dr. Erin Benson, again, welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are really excited to kick off our second annual speaker series, The Intersections of Indigenous Knowledge and Archaeology, today with a lecture from Chief Benjamin Barnes. Sorry, need to enable something. This series is being supported by funds from the Office of the State Archaeologist. So before we really get rolling, just a few little housekeeping details. Participants will remain muted and the video off for the duration of the lecture, but you can submit questions for Chief Barnes in the chat function at any time during the lecture, and a question and answer discussion will follow the lecture as time allows. As I said before, my name is Liz, and I work out of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey's American Bottom Field Station in Collinsville, Illinois. The survey, also referred to as ISAS, is a division of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. We have about 70 full-time archaeologists and support staff working throughout the state, so ISAS is one of the largest archaeological institutions in the US. ISAS is dedicated to the preservation and interpretation of the archaeological and architectural remains in what is now the state of Illinois. I have had the amazing fortune to work with Chief Barnes through Indiana University, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be hosting him now at the University of Illinois, albeit virtually. On behalf of the state archaeologist and director of ISAS, Dr. Timothy Pocketat, today we are honored to host Chief Barnes. Now I would like to advance my slide if I can, and turn it over to UIUC's Associate Vice Chancellor of Native Affairs, Dr. Jackie Thompson-Rand.
Thank you, Liz. It's an honor to introduce Chief Barnes as a guest speaker for the second annual Intersections of Indigenous Knowledge and Archaeology series. Chief Benjamin Barnes of the Shawnee Tribe was elected to his position in 2019. Prior to that, he served the Shawnee Tribe as second chief for 7 years and was a leader in the tribal gaming industry for over 20 years before that. Chief Barnes is a devoted scholar of Shawnee history, language, and culture, and has been involved in preservation efforts for over a decade. He has published scholarship in different journals, including Archaeology and Ethnohistory, and contributed chapters to edited volumes. Most recently, he co-edited the upcoming volume, Replanting Cultures, Community Engaged Scholarship in Indian Country through SUNY Press. It will be out soon. Chief Barnes previously founded an interdisciplinary research group, the Ancestral Pottery Traditions of the Shawnee Project, an initiative that seeks to reclaim traditional Shawnee potting practices. Chief Barnes has worked closely with tribal scholars and artisans, archaeologists, and historians, including myself, to learn more about ancient ceramic technologies. From this knowledge, he and other tribal members have worked toward reviving and recreating their ancestral arts. I would also add that he's an avid fisherman. On behalf of the campus, Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation, Dr. Susan Martinez, and Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Sean Garrick, please welcome my good friend, Chief Ben Barnes.
I usually try to travel with a fishing pole, but I'm on an airplane today and I'm not going to get to do that. And I don't think there's any fish in Washington, D.C. anyway. But I'm really happy, and I'm looking forward to you all coming to Oklahoma soon, but I'm also coming to Illinois. So for the folks at ISAS, I'll be at the SAA in Chicago later this month. We have a couple presentations there, and it's kind of germane to what we're talking about today, about the intersectionality of maybe native ways of knowing, native ways of understanding, and archaeology, and that the two things aren't mutually exclusive. I think for a lot of archaeologists, maybe they understand maybe they think that NAGPRA precludes tribal involvement from research. And I think when NAGPRA is done right, what it really means is free, prior, and informed consent from tribal partners on the research design, the research planning process, what questions are being asked, so that it's of benefit to where there's reciprocity, not just for the researcher and institution, but also for the tribal community. So there may be questions the community would like to answer. And so for us, that's a lot of how our initial questions began, is when I was just an elected official and not a second chief, and certainly not a chief. And Roy Baldridge, who's our current chief, he and I went on the road quite a bit to consult with universities and institutions on the collections, NAGPRA collections, or to have consultations with federal agencies over Section 106, the historic preservation aspect of the tribal nations, our roles in having those conversations. So we very quickly encountered anthropologists, archaeologists, and had to pour ourselves into writings of Vine Deloria, Here Come the Anthropologists, and others. And for us, it became an exploration of, well, how come there's this weird paradigm they call foreign ancient cultures, and Shawnees don't exist prior to that? And Shawnees first start appearing on the pages of history by inference in the American Southeast in 1540, when they run into Hernan de Soto. But prior to that, nobody's connecting the dots. So I think the first time I encountered a question was in Dr. Stephen Warren's second book, I believe it was. He was talking about the work of Penelope Drucker and how those probably more specifically, Dr. Erminy Wheeler Vogelin. So here we are, and we're in the month of celebrating America's women, and I'm talking about Penelope Drucker and Erminy Wheeler Vogelin. And Erminy Wheeler Vogelin, in my opinion, is just a complete juggernaut. Her intellect, her scholarship, she was just an amazing scholar, accomplishing amazing things, not just for the time she was in, but just period. She was just an amazing scholar. And the questions that she was asking, trying to relate what people were seeing out of excavations on mound sites in the Middle Ohio Valley with ceremonial practices of the Shawnees and their neighbors. So that initial question that was posed by Dr. Stephen Warren in his book was using those element lists of Erminy Wheeler Vogelin and looking at Shawnee practices, and that they ought to leave an evidence in the mortuary customs in the archaeological sites where burials occur. Now, this is the intersectionality of this is with tribal nations in NAGPRA. So if we have quality archaeology being done, we can see some of these burial practices. We've seen some of these, Spencer County, Indiana is one that comes to mind, where the CRM firm and the State Archaeological Report actually calls out and cites the Erminy Wheeler's Vogelin's Shawnee mortuary customs of Shawnees and their neighbors in that journal volume. So you can see these echoes of modern day practice of Shawnee peoples, traditional Shawnee peoples, in the ancient soils of the Middle Ohio Valley. So that becomes really intriguing, because now you start seeing also there's a certain evidence left behind with ceramic ware. And those ceramic ware exhibit a particular kind of profile, as described by Penelope Drucker in The View from Madisonville. So these globular jars, some of them with a long-necked, trapezoidal shaped handles, appearing in even numbers, 2, sometimes 4 handles on the outside. But it's very, the silhouette on these jars is very distinct and very different than other jars of other areas, particularly when you cross-reference it with the construction methods of the ceramics. These are muscle shell tempered. And in the latter examples, the later examples from like 1500s, 1600s, you can find these ceramics are very, very thin. So the mastery of the craft, starting with these jars appearing in 800, around the meridian of that meridian of time around 1000, you see very kind of thick, very incised jars with guilloche patterns on the necks. And then it becomes very nuanced, very thin jars, very expressive jars, very almost like there's a systemization of this expression that it's across a very large swath of area. So the question then becomes for us is what can Shawnee people do to explore our burials, our rich history prior to DeSoto through exploring these ceramics? And so I think the first time a Shawnee person expressed that, they were visiting with a Wyandotte ceramicist, Richard Zane Smith, and he makes beautiful jars. He's a wonderful ceramicist. He, at that time, he hadn't done mussel shell temper, and he certainly hadn't done any pit firing. We had to lean on Chase Earls, a caddo potter, to ask him about his experiments with mussel shell and pit firing. And so he gave us his wisdom on what he had learned previously. And so one of our tribal elders asked, well, I was talking to Richard about his wonderful jars, and she's like, well, we should make Shawnee jars. And I happened to just be in their presence near walking by him. And I said, wait, we don't really know what those jars look like, but we do know what our burials look like. And in those burials, oftentimes jars are interred. So why don't we start a research program to re-explore the artistry of these ceramic jars, these globular jars that have this Madisonville silhouette. So that's where our project began and exploring it. So we started collecting clays. We started playing with tempers. Very strange results in our early attempts at tempers. We realized very quickly that marine shell and freshwater mussel have totally seemingly different chemical structures in the way that the way that the mollusk, the bivalve, builds up its shell in layers, where the mussel builds them these beautiful mica-like flakes slowly. And then when it's fired and broken, it's made friable by heating up the mussel shell. You can crush it easy. But the organic chemistry is really interesting because you have to keep the fire between 250 Celsius and 600 Celsius. If you go any higher than that, you begin to change the chemistry of the mussel shell, and it becomes lime and it becomes hygroscopic, and it'll pull humidity from the air and basically just destroy the jar from within. And if you don't fire it above 250, you still have wet clay, and you're not going to get a durable ceramic. So these are really intriguing results. And we got as we were doing these experimental creations, we learned some things along the way, that jars aren't accidentally created. You don't just on a lark go say, hey, we're going to make ceramics. That wasn't happening. There was definitely a class of people, for lack of a better term. They were artisans, that this was their shtick. This is what they did. Some better than others, and because it just really takes a particular craft at it. You have to have a particular touch to start creating these jars, especially when you start getting the latter day created ones with very thin, between 4 and 5 millimeters. That's right, between 4 and 5 millimeters were some of these jars. And so as we got to playing with them and the cord marking, we realized that, in some of the areas of the jar, they were much less than 4 and 5 millimeters because of the cord marking. And when we actually cooked in these jars, we found that the pots were very ready to boil. It didn't require much fuel to bring these pots to boil. So you could use a very low temperature fire and bring your food up to boil really quickly and cook your food really quickly. So there was an economy of fuel, there was economy of time, and you also didn't have to use many resources. So this is all part of our experimentation. And ultimately, we started exploring some of the science, consulting with our friends in archaeology, consulting with some of our friends that work in archaeometrics, and also friends at the University of Missouri at Columbia, the research reactor. We began a process of sending in our mussel shell samples from specific geographies and specific, even shell middens, to start looking at, is there a signature? Is there a specific signature related to Fort Ancient ceramic creation? So for Shawnee people, this is just one project that we've started to explore in relation to our and our history, our prehistory, using archaeology. And maybe Liz, if you could help me, my brain's a little muddled because I am traveling today, and I feel a little wrung out and a little ditzy. So maybe if people have some questions about any of the things I've said thus far, or if you want to prompt me.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chief Barnes. And again, we're extremely appreciative that you could fit time in your schedule to talk to us, as you are quite literally jet setting across the country to take care of business. This is a question that we've asked others in the series, and I know the answer is yes for you. So I won't plug in the specifics, but I will just ask you the general question. Do you have any examples from your own personal experience where your knowledge of tribal history and tradition has helped inform the interpretation of archaeological data, sites, or artifacts?
Some of those, there are some things that I have, there are some suspicions that I have about certain things that have not yet been published or explored yet that I'm infinitely curious about. The ritual distribution of food that's being done in an egalitarian communal way. When it's done ritually, that expression reveals itself in middens by a frequency of bones of certain types in middens. So it ought to be totally randomized, right? So you ought to have the right foreleg ought to appear the same amount of time as any other. But there's, in some middens you see, it's like, how come you see more of those in this midden than you do over there by that person's house? And I can't speak for Mississippian type features, but in Fort Ancient ones, the system of ritual distribution of food seems to be indicated by some of these bones. So that's the one I'm infinitely fascinated in, and that needs explored. But one that is published, to your question, is the one that Brad Lepper and I, Brad Lepper's at the Ohio History Connection in Ohio, and they have a lot of the curation for probably the majority of inadvertent discoveries that have been made in Ohio, as well as some of the early sites and mounds that were dug by Chatrone and others. But Site Mound in Ohio, they dug up at the beginning of what we called modern archaeology. They dug up these five, about 20 millimeter steatite spheres. And at the time, they were called marbles, even though the game of marbles is unknown in the Americas. They were later classified by another living archaeologist as shamanic paraphernalia. Well, when we were standing in a NAGPRA consultation at the Eastern Shawnee, and I'll rehash this, some may have read the paper, and we were standing at the Eastern Shawnee Tribe's complex. We were there consulting with the Ohio History Connection over just an unrelated collection, NAGPRA collection. On its display in its cultural center was a water drum, a small water drum. And I was explaining to Brad how traditional water drums are made. And I get to explaining the stones that we use are these little black 20 millimeter spheres, and how we use those to provide purchase to the animal hide that they're put up underneath the animal hide. So now the cordage has a purchase to pull down on the animal hide to make a taut drum across the water drum. And so Brad's like, are those steatite? He's like, can it be possible to see one of those? So we started collaborating, having conversations. And as we got more and more into the discussions become very apparent that maybe this is just a thing of Occam's razor, where, somebody sees these things and they hear horse hooves and they think zebras and they should have been thinking horses. So we think that those are actually drum stones, these little 20 millimeter stones from Sipe Mound that was in the burnt offering, what they call the burnt offering. We think those are perhaps the only things that were left of a water drum, where a water drum was consumed in that fire. And the only thing that would have been left that was non-organic would be the stones that provided purchase to the drum skin. So yes, perhaps so, although it will be impossible to ever prove that for sure.
I hope that's not your flight calling you in the background, telling you it's boarding time. We actually got a question from our colleague at IUMA, Christina Freiberg. She wanted to know specifically about the freshwater mussel shell sourcing, if you were able to identify or distinguish between any of the sources in your preliminary results.
We identified the speciation of the mussel shells in the archaeological features. So archaeologically, we've identified the species of the mussels that are available in those environments. Now, it's quite probable that, I won't say probable, it's quite possible that some mussels were used in the making of drums while some were not. And who knows what those reasons might be. But in the middens, there's certain species that we were able to identify. And so we have sent those off to the research reactor at Columbia, Missouri. And our collection, I believe, has been combined with a study by John Peacock. That presentation will be at SAA later this spring. And even I haven't seen those results yet. I have no idea what she's found, and I'm so excited. So I haven't really had a chance to visit with her, because I am very much an archaeology nerd, but I have to be tribal chief first. So I don't get to put as much time and effort into the things that I really would rather do, which is talking to you guys and talking to Virginie at Columbia. So I'm very excited about those results to hear what they are when I get to Chicago. So we have seen the speciation. What the real problem is for me to explore this problem, to do more with this project, is the water quality problems that we now have in the United States makes finding good quality sources of freshwater mussels from the Shawnee homelands nearly impossible, because so many of the mussels are now protected species. So the places we have been able to get mussel shells have been from places like aquariums ran by the Missouri State Department of Conservation, where they have mussels in with their beavers and otter exhibits. And so whatever's left at the end of the year, they keep them in a box, and we were able to get those. But we went through about 50 pounds of mussel shells in our project, and we quite literally could probably, in order to do any phase of the project, need about 25 pounds of mussel shell at a go, because you're going to have 2-3 pounds of clay, and a third of that is going to be temper. So anytime you make a jar before the wastage, you're going to need, quite a bit of mussel, and you're going to have a project, and numerous people are doing it. So it takes quite a bit of mussel shell for us. So that's been one of the real challenge, and it's a real reflection of the state of America's water quality is our inability to find mussels in Middle Ohio Valley waterways.
Thank
I hope
you.
that answers.
So I wanted to piggyback off of you saying that you would much rather spend time or would like to spend more time geeking out on archaeology stuff with us. Let's pretend we live in an ideal world where time and money doesn't matter. Is there an aspect of Shawnee history that you are currently researching or would like to research if the world was your oyster, or the world was your mussel shell, I could say?
Well, one of the things that we are exploring is obviously is the Shawnee Connections to Fort Ancient. I think it's really misinformed I likened it to buying a jigsaw puzzle. So you buy this 2,500 piece jigsaw puzzle, and you find all the pieces you don't like and you throw them away. And now you build the jigsaw puzzle without those pieces. So if we only interpret pre-contact America by only calling things Mississippian, only calling things Oneota, only calling things Fort Ancient, we're doing tribes like the Muskogees, the Uchis, the Catawbas, the Shawnees, these tribes that were highly mobile, a disservice by not exploring what it looked like in their communities pre-contact. For a lot of them, we know that they stayed put, but with Uchis and Shawnees and some of the others, they were very, very, I don't want to say nomadic, that would be incorrect, but very mobile. They were very mobile people. And so what would they look like upon the landscape? And to pretend that those connections can't be proven, I think is lazy. I think Venn diagrams can be made. So if you have a certain collection from a certain geography during a certain time period, start creating that Venn diagram. You know who's not there. You can start saying, okay, we're in Kentucky, where this is the time period. Obviously, Inupiats are not here. Obviously, Athabascans are not here. And you can start ruling things out as absolutely impossible. You say, well, what's the likelihood we would have Catawbas here? What's the likelihood we could have the modern Muskogee Creek Nation here? And you can start putting things into the Venn diagram as a list of candidates and start narrowing it down to the likely suspects. But what's really intriguing for Shawnee people, we have places in Savannah, we have historical villages in Charleston, where you see ceramics that suspiciously look like Madisonville ceramics. So how do you have 17th century Shawnee villages with Madisonville ceramics? That's one question that I would explore. I'm also infinitely interested, like in Maze Lick, where a village, I was there for 800 years, and there was no big man society. There was egalitarian with families, and those families lived there. So is it exciting to write about? No. Should it be right about? Absolutely. So creating opportunities to create more scholarship, to be more generative of archaeological work that has academic rigor. And I point that out because after this last Hopewell Comet thing, I think academic rigor, we really need to, make sure that claims to indigeneity do not replace academic rigor.
Thank you. I've got another question from Logan Pappenfort. What was the largest challenge when it came to reintroducing practices such as pottery making for a tribal nation that has lost that knowledge through removal, specifically in educating the tribal citizens about the project and generating new artisans?
Well, Logan, I hope you're settling into Illinois really well. I miss seeing you occasionally, and I'll see you soon. But for us, I'm not quite certain that these traditions are exclusively Shawnee. So I first want to put that out there. Do I think they are most likely? I do think they're most likely. I think more exploration is necessary, which is why we have the project at University of Missouri. I think we're going to be able to tell a lot, perhaps, from the Charleston, Savannah, and some of our other historic sites of the 17th century, and see if those things tell us anything at all. I suspect that people made their ceramics and took them with them, rather than traveled to a far place, not knowing if resources, good clay, good mussels would be available. So I suspect we're going to see people bringing ceramics out of the Ohio River Valley into Charleston and Savannah and other places where Shawnee historic villages are in the American Southeast. So, but the real challenge again is mussel shells. There's just not enough to do anything in substance. We can't do it in quantity. It's not sustainable right now.
Thank you. I've got a sort of a similar question from one of my ISAS colleagues, Jake Skousen. I'm really intrigued by the idea of pottery being a specialized practice performed by certain people. How is or was that knowledge passed down along family lines, among friends, from an expert to apprentice? Your theories
I,
on that?
I really think it's like a lot of things, and I think Occam's razor again. Some of us that have two left thumbs probably ought not be ceramicists. I think there are those that are good at it that did it, and those who are not good at it found other things to do. So I don't know if there's, I'm not saying there's a caste or a class, but I do think you can't achieve consistently those 4 and 5 centimeter or 4 and 5 millimeter vessels without having a particular, without being well practiced at it. So I think it was probably shown to uh, children. I'm not convinced it was totally done all by women. Could be all done by women. I'm not convinced of that. There's no evidence that that was all women making ceramics. I'm pretty sure that small children were making ceramics. There's some evidence of very small fingernail imprints in some of the design marks on Fort Ancient examples that are at the Kentucky Archaeological Survey. And they're very, very small fingernail marks. So those could be the marks of a child or someone with very small hands. But I suspect they were teaching children how to make jars. It's probably why some jars are a little more rugged than others too, is some of the smaller jars, the little pinch pots and things like that, might be what children started learning on. I don't know that, but it could reasonably be that you let your children make smaller, more thicker, more sturdy little jars.
Excellent. We have another sort of ceramics question. The Fort Ancient ceramics you mentioned, thin-walled, shell-tempered, sound very similar to Oneota ceramics. Have any comparisons or links been made between Fort Ancient and Oneota ceramics?
I'm not an archaeologist. I don't really know that question, but I've seen the silhouettes of those Oneotas, and they don't look anything like the Madisonville Horizon pottery. What about the ones that were found in Kentucky, West Virginia, and in some of the American Southeastern Shawnee sites? So I suspect that technology is shared, and technology meaning this is how you fire this type of clay. You need it to, and one of the things we learned is fire the clay at night so that your eyes can see the certain color of red when the ceramic starts to glow. If it starts to glow like red like a cherry, you've went too far and you're above 650C. Congratulations, now your pot will spall within the next week and a half. But if you can try to keep it just when it starts to glow, then you can usually have a successful fire. So I believe they were firing these pots at night. So I believe the technology and the education, the profession of were shared, how to the craftsmanship was shared, how to use mussel shells, how to make the mussel shells more friable for inclusion into the ceramic paste, and also the ratios, of course, of the ceramic paste. That's another thing I'd like to explore, Liz. I'd like to really take a deep dive in on the ratios of the mussel shell to the clay, and see if their trial and error, how close towards optimized did they get it? Because there's got to be that little sweet spot, that honey spot, where it's the strongest possible and without being brittle. And there's got to be something in there. And I wonder if that type of practice became that fine where they had zeroed it in on specific ratios.
If I'm remembering correctly, at one stage in the Shawnee Pottery project, we were thinking about trying to do CT scans of sherds to try and quantify the shell tempering and maybe get at that. Is that still something that might happen in the future?
I would love for it to happen in the future. Again, to be able to do some of the work with. I think that's another project to ask another set of questions. What I think might be really interesting is it would lead to some questions about, are they paddling out slabs and mending slabs together, or are they coiling it and using coils and then mending the coils together? I don't think I have an answer to that. I think sometimes we see evidence of coils, but that doesn't mean it's not evidence. It's proof of coils, because it could be that it was slabs pinched together and mended, and then the upper portion of it may have been finished with coils, is how you get this beautiful necks. I don't know that, but I think if you could get some of these larger jars and CT scans, maybe you could find those margins and see if those margins are expressed, and then try through experimental pieces to see if you could replicate those seams.
Absolutely. I've got a follow-up comment and question from ISAS Director Timothy Pocketat. He says, Chief Barnes, inspiring and intriguing thoughts. Thank you. Would it be useful to have a tribal/archaeologist ceramic conference where we all sit around and compare pottery technologies?
Well, you know what? We were talking about throwing a archaeology conference where Shawnees are exploring their Fort Ancient connections. So there's no reason that couldn't be one of the panels at such a. We're actually planning that now. Whether it happens in 2022 or 2023 is the question, and it's largely due to my travel schedule. Because we were going to try to do it in June of this year, and that's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. So I suspect it's probably going to happen in 2023. But I think, yes, I think that could be a lot of fun. I have a wish list. I want to invite Penelope Drucker to be like the speaker for that event. And, her be like the guest speaker, special guest speaker, because I would just sit there and just listen to her talk for an hour. I would just be mesmerized.
Well, I have no authority to speak for ISAS, but I'm going to, and that we would be really interested in being of service to that conference in any way that we could be. Now I have a question from Dr. Jackie Thompson Rand. Question for Chief Barnes. Do you find any hints about ancestral arts in what you know about the language? Are there any cross references anywhere?
Oh man, Jackie, that's a really good question. We were talking about there's a lot of things encoded into the DNA of the language, related to the arts. I don't know if I've been able to. I don't know if me or anyone else has inferred anything regarding arts, but some of the things that are encoded in the language is that weird tendency of Fort Ancient communities towards egalitarianism and no big man societies I've seen elsewhere. That's encoded in the language in the weird way that we're very specific about speaking about ourselves and others, and almost the community values is superior to individual values, and that is coded in verb conjugation. I think that philosophy being encoded in the way that verbs are conjugated is completely amazing. So the way that is there's if you were to list all the possible ways to conjugate transitive verb, so I to you, you to me, I to you all, y'all to me, and then can continue this they to y'all, they to me, and then you end up with this huge list of way things get conjugated. Well, the primacy is you conjugate it whenever it's y'all first or you first. So you are more important than me. And when I'm conjugating, I am more important than them. So the primacy, so it's you, me, them in that order. And so having the language codified that way, where you can see the philosophy of this, where communal rights are more important than individual rights, down in the DNA of the language, that's intriguing. As for art, I don't know, Jackie, and I'm probably not smart enough to see that. I'm not the art guy.
Thank you. Since you are speaking to at least a half full room of archaeologists, I suspect, do you have any suggestions for resources about the Shawnee Tribe that archaeologists can look to?
Resources for archaeologists to look to. I would, first, there are 3 Shawnee tribes: the Absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and the Shawnee Tribe. Those are the three groups to speak towards. Anyone that has a client that claims to be speaking on behalf of a group, I would check into that first. Make sure you're talking to the actual tribal historic preservation officer as listed by the National Park Service, because a person can, make claims that they're THPO and they're not. It would be like someone claiming to be your state historic preservation officer and they're not. So there's ways to find that out. And those are designations that are tough to achieve. And those are given out by the National Park Service through a grant award. for the, you have established the office of the National Park Service. So reach out to tribal historic preservation offices. What I would really do is engage tribal nations at their events, like where they're living. Right now, you have coming up the Miami Yankee Conference at Miami University. That's a great place to listen to the scholarships being done by Miami people for Miami people. These are questions that are being derived from the communities asking the questions. They're in the driver's seat, and the anthropologist, the archaeologist, the linguist, the ethnobotanist, they're the toolkit. They are the tool that gets used. I remember when I was a kid, I remember going to my dad's toolbox. He was a tap and die engineer. He's in the manufacturing industry. He was actually a manufacturing engineer, and he had all these cool tools. And I think even though I at the time didn't know what all those tools did, sometimes you could use one of those tools and it would accomplish a thing in a new and kind of cool way. I think that's the way that some tribal historic preservation officers approach the disciplines of anthropology, archaeology, etc. Is we can look at it from a different perspective and use the same tools, but they're using it in a different way to come to a research question that's never been asked. So I think that's the best way, is to start having conversations, engaging, and finding out what's important, because sometimes the things that you're going to hear might surprise you. I was at a conference where Cambridge University was doing a big mea culpa on some, they had borrowed collections from the AMNH, and AMNH failed to do NAGPRA consultations on their remains. And so Cambridge is doing the big mea culpa, and I'm sorry, the consultation didn't happen. Can we please publish? So there's like 25 tribal nations, and they're like, really? You're asking us? But what came out of it was really interesting conversations about the promise of genomics and what kind of questions can be answered out of genomics on these ancestral collections. So previously, I was under the impression this was anathema, that we're just not going to be talked about. Boy, was I completely wrong. Now, is it an anathema to some? Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think if tribes are driving the research questions, you will be shocked. And it shouldn't be any surprise to us, because it looks as what's happened to Egyptology, and with once Egyptian people started driving their own research questions over Egyptian collections and driving, Egyptian archaeology, rather than allowing, the British Museum and others just to hoard Egyptian archaeological items. So I think when tribal nations are, put into the driver's seat, you're going to have new and novel research questions and better research outcomes.
Thank you. I think probably our final question, and this one we've asked everyone in the series: how can non-native residents of Illinois and the wider Midwest serve as allies to the Shawnee and other removed tribes?
Well, I think one of the ways that we've seen recently is that lots of places want to recognize, lots of places want to and it can be the form of a land acknowledgement. It can be a form of just diversity, equity, inclusion statement. But if those things don't have actions, if they're not doing things that are making things better for Indigenous communities, not handfuls or one or two Indigenous peoples, we don't be tokenizing people, but real tribal nations and their communities. And it's done with the free, prior, and informed consent of those communities. I think that's how we get to a place of real allyship and not just empty genuflections.
Thank you. I think that's an incredibly poignant and powerful statement to end on, especially since you're going to be hopping on a plane. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen really quick again. And say thank you again for everyone attending, and a huge thank you to Chief Barnes for taking time out to join us. On behalf of the Prairie Research Institute, the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, and the Office of the State Archaeologist, again, thank you to Chief Barnes, and thank you all for attending and your fabulous questions. This lecture was recorded and will be posted on the ISAS YouTube page probably by the end of the week for further viewing. And before we sign off, I want to point you to what's on your screen, which is our next event in the series on Monday, April 11th at 3 p.m. Central will be hosting Betty Gadke, who is a potter from the Quapaw Nation. We hope to see you there. Thanks to everybody and have a great evening. And I should say, have a safe and hopefully smooth flight to you, Chief Barnes.
Thank you. It's good to see you again. We'll see you all
It was great
soon.
to see you.